Hello everyone, happy 2026. It has recently been snowing here, which has been an excellent start to the year for me, and today I'm going to be going through everything that I read in 2025, and that will include everything that I read for my degree last year. So I used Storygraph to track my reading, and according to Storygraph, I read 41 books last year, which isn't a huge amount, but the density of books around October and November is very high, which is expected because I have to read a lot for my degree, which is in theology, religion, and philosophy of religion. Unsurprisingly, the genre that I read the most of this year was philosophy. I read 20 philosophy books apparently, and then 9 literary books, 8 history books, and 7 religion books. The papers that I had my supervisions on this term that just passed were on ethics and the anthropology of religion, so it makes sense that philosophy is the genre that I've read the most of, also because I just read a lot of philosophy for fun anyways. And also throughout this video, I'm not going to spoil anything that happened in any of the books because that would just be really sad. But let's go back to the start of the year where I finished Lessons by Ian McEwan on the 8th of January. I adore Ian McEwan's writing. It's really vivid and it makes you really empathise for the characters, but it also has the right level of complexity that it makes me feel engaged. But at the same time, everything just feels so realistic, and yet all of his stories feel a bit too intense to be realistic, which I find really enthralling. And from what I recall, Lessons follows one boy's life from childhood into adulthood, and especially how his trauma from when he was a child infiltrates the rest of his life. And I found the scale of this book to be really ambitious, and I think it was executed really well. I'd highly recommend that book. And then afterwards, on the 14th of January, I finished The Story of a New Name by Elena Ferrante, and it's the second book of the Neapolitan novels, so it follows after My Brilliant Friend. I read My Brilliant Friend a few years ago. The main character, who is called Lena, I believe. I could be wrong about that, I'm really bad at remembering character names. But the way that she views the world is so intense, and I feel like it's a heightened state of childhood almost, which I think is really effective to use as a narrator's voice because it makes the whole story come to life more. So going into this book, I was really excited, and I think that this one kind of shows that really bright view of the world starting to fade, but also starting to intensify as it becomes more rationalized. It felt like my view of Lena was being shattered as she grew up, which is exactly what the book is supposed to make you feel. But I want to hold on to that idea of her being young and vivacious for a bit longer. And then on the 24th of January, I finished Anna Karenina, which I'm sure I started in 2024. And this book, it felt like I should have read it when I was older, just because I feel like I'm too young to relate to what's happening in it. I mean, there were many life lessons to be gained, and also it taught me to be more patient in reading because it is, I don't want to say dreadfully long, but it is very long. But I did enjoy the writing. And then in February, I finished Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I have been religiously reading Sally Rooney's novels since Conversations with Friends whenever they get released. I really enjoy her storytelling. I don't know why people are Sally Rooney haters. I generally really enjoy her storytelling, and I enjoy how she fixates on just the relationships between characters and what's being said and what isn't being said. And I feel like the application of her method, of her style to this story about grief was really interesting. I don't think it was the most enjoyable of her books for me, but I would definitely say that it was a good one. Also in February, I finished The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, which was absolutely brilliant and I would say life-changing. It's a dystopia and it blends together themes that I find really interesting of religion and human nature. My favourite theme in the book was about ephemerality, about how short-lasting everything is. I also finished Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Malors. I can't remember what happened in it, but I remember really enjoying it. I then read Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger, and I think this was also an excellent novel. I think it was really short, so I suppose it could be a novella. It follows two siblings, I believe, separately and then together, and I think that the observations about the world, again, in this novel were absolutely incredible, and the thought systems that the two eponymous characters discuss are really fascinating. I feel like this is quite a philosophical novel, or it could be read as one, but it's also really enjoyable, and it will also make you think about how you view things in the world and other people and how you interact with people in the world. So I would definitely recommend that. Okay, and now we skip from March to June because I had my A-level exams, and when I read, I find I get really fixated, and if I'm enjoying a book, I won't want to do anything else other than finishing that book. So I didn't allow myself to even pick up a book during my A-levels because otherwise I would not have revised effectively. So from March to June, I didn't read anything, and so on the 25th of June, I finished Book Lovers by Emily Henry because I wanted something fun to get me back into reading. And I also, unfortunately, can't remember anything that happened in that book, but I remember finding it relatively enjoyable. And then on the 7th of July, I finished Less by Andrew Greer. This book was, again, really, really impeccable. I think I had good luck with choosing the books that I read this year. I remember I absolutely could not stop reading this book. It was so fascinating. Even though I didn't relate to the main character, I felt that I empathised with him a lot. It's about a writer in his 50s who's kind of failed. He's not really achieved any greatness, supposedly. I don't know how I feel about the metric of greatness, but anyways, it follows him trying to run away from his problems, which was really interesting. And I felt like I empathised with him a lot because the book characterised him really well. It made sense why he thought his thoughts. It was a really fun and interesting and gripping read, and I would recommend reading it, which I fear I've said about nearly every book that I've talked about so far, so we'll see how that goes. Maybe you'll have a really long reading list after this video, unless you've already read some of these books, in which case you should comment what you thought about them as well. And then on the 9th of August, I finished Exciting Times by Naisha Dolan. I remember also being really gripped by this book, but I also found it really frustrating because I remember finding the main character really obnoxious. I can't remember why now. I hope that's not a bad reading of the character. I think I found Exciting Times frustrating because I think the main character doesn't know what she wants. I don't think that she's even necessarily happy with how things are. She just doesn't know how to effect change. Maybe that just says something about my character, but that's just why I didn't enjoy reading Ava's thought processes. I remember having to finish the book because I was so annoyed by this person that I just wanted to understand why they were thinking these things. So if that was the author's intention, then I think they did it well. And then on the 13th of September, I finished Beloved by Toni Morrison, which was absolutely impeccable. I really enjoyed how this book again played with themes of religion. I really enjoyed how it played with the non-dogmatic theme of religion. The way religion was like interspersed within the book. It felt really free-flowing and really gripping. I think Toni Morrison is absolutely a genius because this book is incredible. I also forgot to mention that I read a lot of books online just because I find that I have less to focus on if I don't have to hold the physical object of the book. Although sometimes, it depends on the story, sometimes I find it more gripping to hold a book. I mean literally gripping, to grip a book while reading it. But at other times, I find that it's easier to just look at my laptop and read the ebook version. But I did read Less and Beloved physically. And then I read this book, La mort n'oublie personne by Didier Deninck. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. If anyone knows how to pronounce this name, I would greatly appreciate the help. I remember enjoying this book. It's one of the 2 French books that I've read this year, and I believe this covered 3 timelines, and I enjoyed how each one was, I felt they were well characterized and the storylines followed, and I enjoyed the characterization and how real the characters felt, but also they felt But it also felt like there was a smokescreen over the characters, so you weren't entirely sure whether they were trustworthy or not, which was very interesting. I then read Nutshell by Ian McEwan, which I did talk about a lot in my first video, but this book was really interesting. It follows a fetus that's unborn, which narrates the story of its mother plotting a murder. It was very good, it was very weird, and if you're looking for something fun and weird and interesting, then you should read that book. And then we get on to my uni reading. At uni, I have effectively kind of one essay per week, but there is some crossovers, so for some weeks I do have 2 essays. So for the first week, my ethics essay was on Plato's Republic. So I did my reading on Plato. I read Plato's Republic, and then I read Julia Annis's Introduction to Plato's Republic, the Routledge Guide to Plato and the Republic, and the Blackwell Guide to Plato's Republic. I would recommend all of those guides. They were all very accessible. I would say the Routledge one was probably the most accessible one, and then the Blackwell Guide and also Annis's Introduction had the most interesting nuance. There are lots of different ways that people read Plato, but those are what I would recommend. And then after that, I read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So this was for my second week of ethics essays. So that was the primary text that I read, and then I read secondary texts to help make sense of the primary text of the original Aristotle. And also the secondary texts help to introduce critiques and arguments surrounding the text. So then I read Michael Pakaluk's Introduction and Lear's Aristotle, The Desire to Understand. And I also read the Routledge Guide to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Then I also read Thomas Nagel, Aristotle on Eudaimonia. I just wanted to say about Aristotle and Plato, I had previously only heard some of their ideas, like about Plato's forms, which are the ideals of things and also ideas. So for example, like he says there's a form of the good, which is the metaphysical ideal of what the good is. So I'd had some ideas like that, and also his like analogy of the cave, which is about how our perceptions are just shadows in comparison to real reality, which we can only access through philosophy. But actually reading the original texts, it made me realise that ancient philosophy was actually more progressive than I had previously thought. Because like a lot of people nowadays, my first introduction to philosophy was people like Camus. But now that I'm properly studying philosophy at Cambridge, reading the original texts of Plato and Aristotle made me realise how progressive ancient philosophy actually is. It's just really fascinating how their ideas about the world and beyond the world and what it is to be good are really fascinating, and the way that they picture stratifying society is really fascinating, and I don't think it's ever been properly realised, as in the ideas of society have never properly been used as a structure, but they're really interesting and foundational, but also some bits have perhaps been forgotten, so then they could also be useful today to enact motion. So I found reading ancient philosophy for the first time really interesting. Okay, and then in week three of my ethics essays, I wrote an essay on David Hume. So I first read his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which was then followed by his Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. I remember that I found Hume quite difficult to get through, so I only had time for one secondary literature that week, which was the Cambridge Companion to Hume. And I just read the bits that were relevant to the enquiries. And then my fourth ever Cambridge University essay was on Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And this book was really, really fascinating because it has a lot of fictional elements that Kierkegaard uses to illustrate what he thinks faith is. And this whole book concerns faith and morality and how faith affects morality. So after reading Fear and Trembling, I read Claire Carlyle's Guide to Fear and Trembling, as well as Jeffrey Hansen's Kierkegaard and the Life of Faith. I read the Routledge Guidebook to Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And then I read Mooney's Nights of Faith and Resignation, reading Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. Oh, I also read Patterson's Kierkegaard and the Crisis of Faith, an introduction to his life and thoughts. I find Kierkegaard's focus on faith really fascinating, and I think that beyond just being a religious faith, it can also be extrapolated into a lot of how we view the world, how we just have faith in things happening. So that was really fascinating. And then for my 5th ethics essay, it's going to be on Kant. I haven't done it yet. It's due in a couple weeks still. It's going to be on Kant, so I've got Kant's The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, and also Kant's Critique of Practical Reason. And I've heard a lot about Kant being scary and hard to read, but hopefully I'm not jinxing it, but I've found him reasonably accessible. Perhaps it's just because I've been writing this essay over the Christmas break, I've given myself more time to read these books, so perhaps that has made it more easy to process what he's saying. But if you've been afraid of reading Kant, don't be. I think especially if you already have an understanding of his a priori method, you should definitely read him, because I think everything is structured really clearly. And then we get into all of my readings for my Anthropology of Religion paper. So firstly, I read The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber. I think the Weber book is really foundational if you want to learn more about the anthropology of religion. It was really fascinating to read about how Protestantism's values have affected the modern Western world. And then I read Marx's Capital. So Marx's analysis of Capital is also very fascinating. The Globalization of Charismatic Christianity by Simon Coleman. I also read Rahul Rao's Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Post-Coloniality, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. It really clearly goes through the post-colonial surroundings of queer politics. And I also read Visibly Muslim, Fashion, Politics, Faith by Emma Tarlow, and I found the case studies, particularly in this book, very fascinating about how modern Muslim women navigate the world. I also read Steve Bruce's Secularization in Defense of an Unfashionable Theory, in which he proposes a statistical analysis of what secularization is, which I don't think is very effective, because I don't think you can effectively measure religious adherence through statistics. But it was interesting to see that method nonetheless. And then I read Religion in Britain, A Persistent Paradox by Grace Davey, which I recall conflicting with Bruce's secularization. I also read the book of Jerry Falwell, Fundamentalist Language and Politics by Susan Friend Harding. For the Anthropology of Religion paper, I also read Emile Durkheim's The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which was very fascinating because it was a pioneer in the field. But like most pioneers, you can tell there are some faults in it, such as him never actually conducting on-the-ground ethnographic research himself. But it was groundbreaking for what it is. I also read Purity and Danger by Douglas, which was absolutely excellent. I never previously challenged what I had thought of as dirt. Reading this book made me realise that a lot of what we call cleanliness and dirt in society is only there for societal reasons, to simulate order rather than being an actual substance. She defines dirt as matter out of place, which I thought was a very, very fascinating definition. I also read Geertz's The Interpretation of Cultures. I read Talal Assad's Genealogies of Religion, Discipline and Reasons of Power in Christianity and Islam. And then I read Available Light by Clifford Geertz. I also read a very fascinating journal article. I'm sorry, I'm not too sure how available it is to the public, but it's by Saba Mahmood, and it's called Feminist Theory, Embodiment, and the Docile Agent, Some Reflections on the Egyptian Islamic Revival. That journal article was really interesting. It was about in Egypt within the Temple Revival, and it followed how these women use strict adherence to Islam to promote their own autonomy, which is incongruent, I think, with the general Western view of Islam, which is why I found it really interesting. So my term ended at the start of December, and I have a couple more books that I just read for fun afterwards. I read La Mort Heureuse by Albert Camus. I think this is probably the 5th Camus book I've read at this point. And probably the 3rd one that I read in French. I adore Camus, and I especially enjoy his books in French because I feel like they're more bright and fantastic, and that's just something that I really enjoy in fiction generally. Especially his book L'étranger, or The Outsider in English. I really adore that book in French because I'm sure if you've read this book you'll know what I'm referring to, but I won't spoil it. The point where everything seems to explode is really, really bright in French. This one, La Mort Heureuse, was more subdued, but it wasn't happy, but I enjoy how he addresses the questions that I felt were left unanswered in L'étranger. So if you feel like there was something missing after you read The Outsider by Camus, I would definitely say that you should read A Happy Death, because Merceau is, because it's kind of taken as a prequel to The Outsider. But I think it's great to read afterwards or before, but you should just definitely read both, even though I believe Camus didn't want to publish A Happy Death because he didn't feel it was polished enough. But I think the philosophy in A Happy Death is more clear because there's a lot more musing than in The Outsider, where it's more punchy. So I would say definitely to read A Happy Death if you want a more foundational philosophical musing. I also read The Trading Game by Gary Stevenson, which I had picked up in the summer because I wanted to learn about economics, and it did teach me about economics, and it taught me about wealth inequality, which is very important. It was a very accessible book, so if you've also never read anything about economics like me, then you should definitely read it. So that's everything I read in 2025. I hope you enjoyed this video and also everything that you read this year as much as I did, because I certainly enjoyed everything I read this year. If you have any questions or suggestions, then you should comment those down below. But I hope that you have a good rest of your day, and goodbye.